work hard. That isn't the end of the world. You've got to pick up and find something else to do. And I found it here. I remember meeting your mother, Margaret Alva, when she came to the United Nations in the very late 80s or early 90s. She'd come as a part of the General Assembly delegation. We got along like a house on fire. And we saw each other on her frequent visits thereafter. Little did I realize that one day I would be following her into her party politics in India. It was farthest thing from my mind. But life goes on, and that's what happened.
So now that we have you with us, and you have been involved in agenda setting, where do you feel we can drive India forward? What are the key areas to actually create a new world order?
Look, that's probably a very tall order, but let's get a couple of things straight. Right now, the people who are on top of this, at this high table that I called it, they are not exactly in a hurry to squeeze their elbows in and make room for new people. And the irony is countries like China and India and Brazil, for that matter, South Africa, others, they're not really anxious to knock the table over. Unlike if you're a history fan, you know that at the beginning of the 20th century, the long peace from 1815 onwards that had kept Europe at peace essentially ended because countries like Germany and Japan just didn't like the existing world order and said, we need a new world order, we're going to destroy this one. I feel that countries like China and India actually just want to be accommodated within the existing world order. They're not actually trying to turn it upside down. But what's happening is the small-mindedness of the leaders of the richer countries has actually prevented the kind of progress that might have staved off a crisis. I'll give you one example. In 2008, the G20 met in Pittsburgh. And they said, given all that's happening, the growth. China, for example, at that point, had the same weighted vote in the Bretton Woods institutions, the World Bank, the IMF, GATT. The Bretton Woods institutions are the institutions set up at a place called Bretton Woods in New Hampshire, basically to manage the world economy at the end of the Second World War. And why should China had the same weighted vote as Belgium? And it seemed absurd because China, obviously, of 2008 was not the China of 1945. And so they naturally wanted more authority and more space, and India supported that. And there were also other emerging economies like India, where we had risen in terms of our market. And there were the so-called transition economies, that is the former East European countries, who no longer being under the communist straitjacket, they'd opened up and they were also growing rather rapidly. So the deal was arrived at in 2008 that there would be now 50-50 parity between the voting power of the rich developed countries on the one hand and the emerging and transition economies, including China and India, on the other. Seemed a fair deal. Everyone agreed. Everyone went very happy. That was 2008 September. 2009 went by, 10 went by, 11 went by, 12 went by. It never got implemented. Why? Because to implement such a deal, you need the agreement of all the key powers who currently are sitting on top of the Bretton Woods institutions. And in the US's case, the US Senate had to ratify it, and the US Senate just didn't ratify it. It finally was in the first months of 2016.
7 years later that they did that.
7.5 years later, January or February 2016, that they finally ratified this deal. Now, in the meantime, what happened? The Chinese and the Indians started saying, we're never going to get a fair shake from these guys. They ended up setting up the BRICS New Development Bank. You remember about that? Shanghai with Mr. Kamath from India as the president, and the Chinese offering to host it and provide the basic expenses. What was the signal there? The signal that I got is very clear. We want a level playing field, but if you won't give us a level playing field, we'll go off and build a playing field of our own. And China, because it had become so rich in the meantime, actually has the strength to make such a threat stick. Why would a small country need to go to the World Bank where China doesn't have a vote? If it can go to a bank where China not only has the vote, makes the decisions and has the money to give them. They don't care where they get the money. They want the money for their development. So this suddenly became a very important warning shot across the bow that says to these rich countries, listen guys, you want to play it your way, you'll end up playing by yourselves. We'll go.
This is exactly this problem you've described really incisively. You say that today's power structures are anachronistic. They reflect 20th century power politics in which the US is in the driver's seat. But the 21st century world is a very different place. How should the US get up tomorrow and look at the world differently? What would you prescribe?
Well, Mr. Trump is already confusing the heck out of everybody, right? Because one day he wants to pull all his troops out of every country that they're in. He literally has just issued a statement welcoming the Philippines' decision to kick the Americans out of the bases they built in the Philippines. That was last week. He has announced his desire to withdraw from Afghanistan, which obviously will be a gift horse to the Taliban, who promptly will take over. He has announced his desire to pull out of Syria. He doesn't want to send his troops anywhere abroad. He wants to make America great again by making it not great internationally, by focusing on his domestic situation. That's his choice. But in that case, nature abhors a vacuum. Who's going to fill it? If it's China, some of us have to worry. If you have a China playing a role on the global stage that's analogous to the role that the US has played for the last 50 years, I think that countries like India would have a lot to worry about, because the US, for all its overreach, was a benign power. I mean, yes, Americans had their motives, and their motives largely had to do with making money. With China, the motives may have to do with other things. And that's what truly worries many of us who look at the global geostrategic picture. So a world order in which China's weight and rise is recognized duly, but where other countries like India have recognized places as well, a multipolar world, is one that many of us would like to work towards. India has further virtues. It's a democracy. I hope still it is. I mean, I have some worries about where that's going. But it is a democracy. It is a pluralist society. It's a society with remarkably successful management of its own diversities. And it's a country which has, frankly, the capacity, the human resources, the technological ability, and the diplomatic skills to actually help make these rules that we were talking about earlier on everything from cyberspace to outer space. Why shouldn't we? So what we are prescribing in the book is a world in which a country like India would play a much more influential role. I don't know how many of you who read my books have read a book called PAC Syndica, which I published in 2012. That was actually a study of India's foreign policy. But I came to the same conclusion from this way. So in other words, I studied India's relations with various countries and our overall strategy in the world of international affairs. And I concluded with a plea that we should take on a far more active role on the world stage. The plea was ignored, but that was my conclusion now 8 years ago in that book. In this book, I don't discuss Indian foreign policy. We start off looking at the world, global governance. But we end up in the same place, which is that India, and a country like India, for all its virtues, has and should have an influential role to play. Now, obviously, my co-author and I will probably part company on what I would say next, which is that what worries me about today's domestic political context is that the India that is being shaped in the last 6 months, since my manuscript went off to press, is unfortunately an India that is not quite the India I described, that's ready to play an influential role on the world stage, because an India that seems to be more sectarian, more narrow-minded, more intolerant of dissent, more unwilling to cope with its diversity or even recognize its diversity as a strength rather than as a weakness. An India that in many ways has become the India of the CAA protests. That India will not be an example to anybody else in the world and will probably not be welcomed in the way that I would have hoped when I was writing this book.
So going by what you said, India is still a key player in global governance and development. You have US on one hand, who is a geopolitical leader. You have China on the other, who is geoeconomic. As you said, India is into the technological front, cyberspace, outer space. What more do you envision for our country?
I was wondering where you were going with this geopolitical, geoeconomic, and India seems to be just geo. But she didn't. She resisted the temptation. I just succumbed to it. The fact is that my dreams for India are obviously to echo Nehruji's wonderful speech. I don't know, how many of you anymore remember the Tryst with Destiny speech. I think my generation still read it in school and studied it. But it's striking that at a time when the flames of partition were blazing across the land, Nehruji not only talked about our Tryst with Destiny, but he said that his dreams were not only for India, but for humanity as a whole. And he talked about, in 1947, he talked about how peace is indivisible. That ultimately the world, he said in 73 years ago almost, he said the world is too tightly knit together for any one of us to believe that we can live apart. I think that is the vision that India should be able to bring again. Unfortunately, we have a government that's too busy insulting and repudiating Nehru to be inspired by what he stood for and the ideals and visions that India actually offered the world at that time. As somebody who's quite unabashed in my admiration for that vision, that's essentially the vision that inspires my share of this book.
Reading your book, what really hits me is just how dramatically the world has changed since the Great Recession, 2007, 2009, and 2020. Some of the things you talk about are inequality, the whole majoritarianism space. We have 2,153 billionaires who own more than 4.6 billion people own, and this seems to be just increasing in countries around the world. So, and when you have austerity measures, they hurt the poor the most. Just a little bit about how things have literally last 6, 7, 8 years.
What happened, Niret, is that we've seen two backlashes against globalization. Globalization, I would say the era of pure globalization is about 1980 to 2008, when the mantra was more trade, more openness of borders, where you could move millions and billions across the world with a click of a cursor, where we were knit together first by satellite TV, then by the internet, where the global village that Marshall McLuhan wrote about in the 60s suddenly seemed to have become a total reality. And then you've got a kind of a recession which then provokes a rather significant backlash that we are seeing in the political consequences in a large number of countries west of us. And I would say two backlashes rather than one, because they're actually different. They overlap in some places and they don't in others. I'll tell you what I mean. There's the economic backlash. The economic backlash is largely animated by blue-collar workers and others in the Western countries who found their jobs being shanghaied. I mean, literally their jobs being sent off to China. And for many of them, the American dream was, for 3 generations, Americans bought into the myth that every generation would have a bigger home and a better car and a prettier wife and white picket fence and 2.3 children and a dog, all of that more than their parents had. And for kind of 3 generations, it worked. Suddenly, the first generation to discover that the jobs they were counting upon to deliver that better image for them, those jobs have gone. They're no longer there. I don't know how many of you saw a film called Roger and Me by Michael Moore, one of the first documentary films that actually played like a feature film in movie theaters, now about 20 years ago, where he talked about how in the town of Flint, Michigan, where there was factory after factory owing allegiance to General Motors and companies like that, and where this American dream was being played out, that suddenly these factories are closing. They were closing altogether because it was cheaper to make these cars in Mexico and later, of course, in China. And suddenly you found a lot of people being deeply resentful. The American consumer gained because every item that was being produced was still being produced and he was paying less for it. And he was paying less for it in places like Walmart and so on than he actually used to pay or would have needed to pay if Americans earning American wages were producing it. But while the American consumer was earning more, the American worker was not. And that kind of thing happened across the Western world, and you had this economic backlash. But there was also a culture